Welcome back to Crimson Guitars. Welcome to day 2 of a guitar build. I'm going to take you through the entire process from start to finish. If you haven't watched video 1, go back, watch video 1. In it, I'll probably make a fool of myself at some point, so it's going to be fun. Today we have a guitar body. We have a guitar body with a top glued on it. Could you tell that I didn't know where that sentence was going? What we're planning on doing is removing a load of clamps, and by the end of today I am hoping to have basically a completed T-type guitar body. It will be the final shape routed out, the cavities will be routed out, and it will be ready for sanding and finish and essentially be done. I'm also hoping at some point during the process I will also be doing some work on the neck. Fun times. On we go. The removal of the clamps. This is a highly technical procedure. Alright, now I could cut out the entire guitar and move from there, do some sanding, etc. But the front is relatively raw, and I'm going to hit it with a plane quickly so that I can just essentially it's more about being able to see that clamp is 2mm too short. It's more about being able to see what is happening next. I've got a lot of marks and lines and bits of pieces on here that I want to get rid of, so that when I start drawing the final guitar in place, I know what's happening. And the easiest way to clean that up is with a hand plane. Marking out. My body, the top extends over the edge of the body blank, so I need to make sure I know where that actually ends. And then it's simply a case of finding the prettiest piece of wood and maximizing its use. That's going to be quite attractive. I'm going to use the jigsaw to cut this out to within 2 or 3 mil of the line, and then depending on how that goes, I'll use a router and stroke or a spindle sander to get the final outline. Lovely. We have a guitar. I have several options. I could use the masking tape and super glue trick to tape the template onto here and use a router and a bearing cutter and all of that. But I also have a spindle sander. And for me it's 50-50. So that's 150 grit, talking about 50s. Let's go to something a little bit coarser. For me it's 50-50. If I'm doing a guitar where I do have a full set of templates and that's exactly what I want to make, I will use a router and a bearing cutter and have at it. If I'm doing a guitar where I don't really care what the exact final shape is, or if I'm designing it as I go, then I actually prefer to use a spindle sander to achieve the same result. And that's what I'm going to use today. I've got the basic outline, and well, let's go. This is going to be loud. This machine isn't the extraction, however. This is seriously cool. Well, tiny, but awesome. Okay, we have a guitar shape, and it didn't take messing around with router cutters or templates or too much noise. A little bit of noise, but it's all good. Let's go mess around with some routers and lots of noise. Okay, so that process is fairly straightforward. There are several things though. If you are using the spindle sander, if you stay in one place for too long, you can create a dip, which is hard to get rid of. But the end result is a fairly smooth, homogeneous, lovely line that actually matches the template pretty much perfectly. And as I said at the beginning, I use spindle sanders a lot when I'm doing a one-off custom instrument, because I despise making templates. I don't like working with MDF. I find it boring. It's not the finished guitar. I don't know, it bores me. It's a necessary part of life, but you know, if you can avoid it, avoid it. However, what you can't avoid is the template for routing the neck pocket, pickup cavities, etc. And I'm going to be using a fantastic 3-flute Radian router cutter, and possibly a smaller one to get in there a bit later. But there we go. So I'm just double checking. My cavities are marked out. Wherever possible when routing, I also use a drill, preferably a pillar drill, but this is a limited tool build, so I'll be using a hand drill to hog out as much material as you possibly can. And we need to get rid of that waste before we put the template on. So, several things are required. Drills. Drill bits. Okay, so Forstner drill bits are the best for this job. Very basically, the reason I use these rather than flat bits or anything else is because they do give us a flat bottom to the hole, and that's rather important. Okay, so the trick when you're starting a cut is as you go down, I'm not putting very much pressure on, and let me illustrate this. It's obvious that I'm not going straight at the moment. You want to be able to see that you're going down straight by creating a full circle. Now, we'll teach you best practices as well. Always double check and make sure that you're not going too deep. So, there we go, we've got a prototype crimson depth stop there. As long as we don't go deeper than that, we're sorted. Whoops. So that's as deep as I want to go. You can, with this kind of a drill bit, put a piece of masking tape on it, and that acts as your depth stop stroke guide, which is all good. And if you're using a router cutter or a Dremel, for example, for something, which we often do as luthiers, put a little bit of a flag on here, and it also blows the dust out of the way so you can see what you're doing. Now the problem is, if you try and do the same thing on a standard twist drill, the shavings are pulled up the drill and move your tape. Now, this pocket, this is the one that you need to be very, very careful about. Okay, so our neck is, the neck blank is 19 millimeters thick. That's standard F type, T type, S type, something type thickness for a flat headstock. The rest of the cavities, as long as I don't go through the back, it's really not too much of an issue. Now, I've reached a crossroads here. I have a lovely top. Do I want a scratch plate or not? Now, if I have a scratch plate, I only want my neck cavity to be 16 millimeters deep. If I don't want a scratch plate, I can go down to 18 or so. I think I'm going to do this as if I'm going to design this guitar in advance to have a scratch plate. Why not? Okay, so that depth stop is now set to 16. What I'm also going to do is have a look visually. Okay, that's roughly twice the depth of this of the sides of this cutter. Okay, I'm not going to go all the way down. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. That'll be fine. Okay, same trick. You really don't need that much of this, but okay. I've got nothing square to reference against, so draw on the template where I want the tape to be. So before I started using this trick, I would have to either screw the template to the body, probably through the control cavity or underneath the bridge, and then go at it, or have 2 or 3 clamps, both holding it to the workbench and holding the templates down, and clamps slip, and I have destroyed a fair number of instruments in the process. This is nice and solid, and it means I only really need 1 clamp to hold the guitar down while I work. And well, let's do that then. You don't need to force it. At the same time, you really don't want the router cutter to fall out. It doesn't tend to go anywhere when they fall out. It just tends to ruin your work by going deeper than you're expecting. Fine, I'll tighten it a little bit. When you force it though, you can damage things, which is not ideal. Okay, so first of all, I want to set the depth of the cutter so that it is just resting on the template. Now there's some movement. We have a rack and pinion inside, and you've got the fine adjustment here. The rack and pinion has some looseness. So what I tend to do is I'll push down, adjust it, and while it's pushed down, then put the lock on, so that I know that I'm exactly where I need to be. Okay. There we go. So there's a little bit of handwork to be done. As you saw, the template was as solid as required. And there we have a basic guitar body. I'm going to have to go in with a chisel, tidy that out a little bit. I've made these cavities deeper than really necessary in order to give me a little bit more weight relief than I would otherwise have had, although it's not too bad. And yeah, a little bit of tidying up there. I don't like the shape of that. So yeah, basically there's a strip along here that I'm going to take off in a minute. Okay, this guitar is pretty much there. Now, while I have the router set up, I'm going to try and do the rest of the routing, because that kind of makes sense, really, I think. Somewhat. Possibly. All right. I want to, instead of a round over, I personally prefer a 45-degree chamfer, so I'm going to do that, but front and back, because that's comfortable. I'm going to need to hand plane that or sand that down just a fraction to make sure it's perfectly flat. But what we do have to work on is the neck still. So while the correct router bit is in the router, let's have a look at this. Now, a lot of people, including us, we use the router table quite a lot of the time for this. The problem with the router table is if you don't cut right next to the line, and I'm talking so you can basically see the pencil line and nothing on the outside of it. When you are routing the headstock out, the router tends to grab too much wood, rip it out of your hand, and shatter the headstock. We've had many students go a little bit too far and too fast and shatter headstocks in this way. I've seen it happen far too many times. And if you're doing a basic build, if this is your first time using a router table to make a neck, then quite frankly, just avoid it, unless you have a lot of scrap on which to play around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a standard handheld router to route the basic shaft of the neck, and I'm going to finish the rest of the headstock with a spindle sander, because it's safer, basically. So I could have said all of that while actually preparing for the job. Instead of that, I'm forcing you to now listen to me waffle on about nothing while I prepare. I'm so sorry. Or not, maybe. So, same as before. Mark out where my tape is going to be, and I can then flip it over. And progress nicely. Burnish the tape down. This just makes it hold a little bit stronger. Okay, now while I have this template in place and before I do anything else, just marking out the tuning hole positions. Saves us fiddling about later. Okay. So essentially we're going to be routing the important part. This is less stable because I'm on something there's a little bit little, and I'm going to have to be very aware of what's happening. I'm also not going to go all the way around the edges here. I'm just going to hit that with the bobbin sander as well. But Now, if I'm clever, I should be able to do this without routing into my workbench. If I'm not clever, my workbench is going to suffer. What am I doing? Wrong way around. There we go. That was fiddly. And there we have it. That is the most important part of the neck done. It needs to be straight, it needs to be square. And that's the most important part at this stage. Now I'm going to scribe out the rest of the layout. Pencils are a little bit less accurate than knives. And then we'll move on. Now the last thing we want to do is use the bobbin sander or, well, anything like that while the template is on. You'll notice that I did the cutting with the forstner bits before the templates went on for the same reason. I don't want to damage the template. These things can potentially last you a lifetime, or at least, you know, 5 or 6 guitars. Success. Okay, I have a nice long straight line there. I have a tool good at making nice long straight lines. Use a larger one, get away as much waste as possible, and then go to smaller, less efficient sizes. I need that. And there we have it. The guitar neck is pretty much sorted. I've still got some a little bit of excess from where I didn't want to route into my workbench. That'll be coming away in a few minutes with a hand plane. And the rest will be carved away. We're going to use the spindle sander again later to get the scoop where the headstock rises up into the fretboard. But we will do that, I think, after the fretboard is on. And with that in mind, let's get the fretboard. Okay, our fretboard is it's a beautiful piece of zero cote that I've had my eye on for a while. It is pre-slotted, it is pre-radiused. if you slotting a fretboard is simply a case of drawing lines in the correct place, using a marking knife to make absolutely certain they are accurate, and then cutting them accurately. If this is your first build, I would suggest get them pre-slotted by somebody else. The first 20 or 30 necks that I did probably weren't good enough. Probably. So if you have the option, buy a pre-slotted fretboard. The radiusing, etc., is again fairly straightforward to do. Buy a radius block. I have one that we'll be using later, and have at it, or use a hand plane. You can easily put it in a lovely radius with a hand plane. It is, however, at this stage, we've chosen something a little bit easier. Okay, so I'm going to prepare the neck a little bit more, just to get rid of the little bit of excess. And yes, I am using a giant chisel. Stability. I always think, especially when you're paring down to a large flat surface, that the larger the chisel, the more accurate your paring is going to get. It's going to be. Okay. Now the radius on the end of my fretboard here, sorry, the end of the neck, is tighter than the radius created by the router bit that I used. So I'm going to go in on the spindle sander again in a minute. I've lost my pencil. Aha! And just change that radius. It's not strictly telly. Oh no, I said telly. The radius isn't traditional, or won't be, but that doesn't really matter. And I forget who told me that the spindle sander, oscillating bobbin sander, was the first machine that I needed to buy. And other than a router, I think they're right. It's one of those things that just makes a multitude of tasks easier. Okay, I'm just getting rid of the router marks. And let's see. There we go. Once we've got a little bit of sanding done, that'll be perfect. So, in progress. Yeah. Okay, the reason for actually fitting that neck now is so that we could, or so that I could see just how much material I needed to remove here. That little ledge there was left a little bit larger than required, because if it doesn't match up nicely, that's basically the whole guitar ruined, for me at least. It's yeah, it has to be nice and square and straight and lined up. Anyway, I've marked that out. Back to the spindle sander, and we'll clear that off. So that is now the final shape that I want. I need to plane the back of this flat, and the front is already basically flat, which means that I can happily round over the edges or chamfer the edges, as is the case this time. Masking tape. I do use rather a lot of tape, it must be said. I like the detail that you get from a chamfer. You'll notice I didn't go all the way around here. I'm not sure how big the neck plate is. So we'll leave that for now. Roll that over by hand. Okay, so that's done. I didn't have the 4-flute cutter, so it's burned a little bit on the way around. That's not an issue. We're going to be sanding that out, or scraping that out, or possibly using a spoke shave to spoke shave that out. Trying to come up with other ways I can do it now just to keep the joke going. But in a minute, you will also notice that I just went all the way around, ignoring grain direction and all of those important things. There's a little bit of tear out here, but we were taking a small cut and I wasn't too worried about that. Take an even smaller cut if you are worried about that. Do it in 2 passes or so. You'd probably avoid all of the issues that I've just outlined: burning and tear out, etc. We really do now have a guitar body, and it hasn't been too problematic so far. Now, we're going to set this one aside for now, and I will be back in half a second. We're not even going to stop cutting. I'm just going to go straight to working on the neck. How's that? There we go. Guitar out of the way. Fretboard of awesomeness. Neck of coolness. and I've run out of superlatives. And the truss rod of doom. All right, so truss rod is nice and tight. That's not going anywhere. Just to make certain that I know where I am, I've marked out the nut position on both sides, and that line is going to line up with the nut line there. So I'm going to transfer that round to the back of the fretboard as well, and I might as well do that properly and right now. Okay, I don't want any glue to get into my truss rod channel. This is something that I do that most of my staff don't bother doing. And since most of my staff are more intelligent than I am, I suspect this is probably not necessary. But it does make me feel better about life, so there you go. Okay. There we go. Gotcha. So what I'm going to do is line those nut lines up. And if they have been marked out properly and everything works out as planned, then everything will be correctly lined up. If you are even a millimeter out, your entire neck is going to look really weird. And then what you do is you have a look at the 22nd fret and just double check without knocking my clamps off. I want to make sure that the 22nd fret lines up properly. Hold your ruler up against the end of the fretboard, and that should be the same distance away from that fret slot and in line with it, and it is. So far, so fantastic. Okay. Cocktail time again. Just off the center. You don't want to drill into a truss rod. And you also don't want to drill too deep into the neck, so I've got about 3 mil there. Now, I do need a clamping caul. Because the fretboard is radiused, I've got a caul that's had the center removed, and that pushes down on the sides rather than on the whole fretboard. Whew. I said miss the truss rod. That's right next to it. Fair enough. Okay. So the question is, do I think that's going to move? No. I still haven't found my the lid to my glue. There we go. Double check everything's okay. And that is the reason why I don't use metal or anything like that. This stuff you can just snip it off and you're sorted. Now, as I tightened the clamp, I was actually looking at the corner of the fretboard to make sure that it didn't move under the pressure. Okay, that all looks good. So, essentially, we are now at the end of day 2. The fretboard is glued to the neck, the truss rod is in place. Can you imagine if I'd forgotten the truss rod? That would be hilarious. And we have a completed guitar body ready for the final shaping and sanding and staining and finish. It sounds like it sounded at the beginning of that like we were nearly finished. That's the easy bit. So leave this to cure and we will be back tomorrow with more. Thank you for watching. Click like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And we'll see you soon. Goodbye.